Hi everybody, this is Joe from Mapamundi, and today I'd like to talk about a language topic that is a little bit sentimental to me, and that is the Irish language. Sadly, Irish is actually not one of my better languages. I do have a very good working knowledge of Irish, but I'm not nearly as fluent in Irish as I am in Spanish or Italian or Portuguese, because the opportunity to speak Irish, particularly here in the United States, it doesn't present itself quite as much as it does to speak Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, or German even. Irish is a language that I heard growing up probably the most after English. Both my grandparents, my mother's parents, they studied Irish themselves. And my grandparents used a pretty popular book series called Buntus Cancha, which is pretty well known, I think, in Ireland and in the United States for teaching the Irish language. They did like books on tape, and I think there was a television series back in the 70s before I was born. So it is a language that I have a lot of sentimental attachment to. I wish I spoke it better, but I don't. There's always time to learn, I guess, in the future, but right now I'm focusing on a lot of languages at once, so we'll see what happens. When you talk about the Irish language, you tend to get a lot of questions, particularly from American people, and I'd like to answer some of the commonly asked questions today that I normally get, because there's a lot of confusion about the Irish language, what it is, how it works, and where it comes from. So let's jump right in. The first question that I normally get when I'm talking about Irish is, what is the Irish language? A lot of people are unaware that the Irish language is actually a language of its own, that I'm not just talking about English with an Irish accent. And you tend to see a lot of confusion about that, and then people don't realize that the Irish language is its own language that's quite different from English. They're related by the fact that they're both Indo-European languages, but they're somewhat distantly related in that Irish is a Celtic language and English is a Germanic language. And even though obviously there's a lot of exchange between the two language groups, Irish takes a lot of words from English, and English has taken a few words from Irish, not so many. But they aren't so related with grammar, vocabulary, or at least the similarities aren't readily obvious to somebody who doesn't study these kinds of historical linguistics topics. The most closely related to Irish Gaelic is Scottish Gaelic. They are somewhat mutually intelligible depending on what dialect of Irish you speak. If you speak Ulster Irish, which is obviously spoken predominantly in the region of Ulster, that form of Irish is much more similar to Scottish Gaelic. But southern dialects of Irish tend to be a little bit more difficult to understand if you try to communicate with somebody that speaks Scottish Gaelic. Manx is also a language that is closely related to Irish and Scottish. It's in the same subgroup of the Celtic languages, which is Insular Celtic. Manx is a language that is more or less extinct. The last native speaker of the Manx language died sometime in the 1900s, actually. And the language is well preserved, or well preserved enough, but there are not any native speakers of the language living now. Some more distantly related Celtic languages include Breton, Welsh, and Cornish. Those come from a different subgrouping of the Celtic languages, and we can see that there are cognates in those languages that you can see if you compare Welsh and Irish, that some of the words are similar enough that you might be able to recognize them from one another, but really the two groups are so distinct from one another that if you were to speak Irish with somebody that spoke Welsh, you probably would not understand so much other than a rare word here or there that was similar enough for you to understand. For example, you can see some words are similar enough that you might be able to recognize them. The word for full, as in like the glass is full, in Welsh is llawn, and in Irish it's lawn. The word for house in Irish is teach, in Welsh it's chi. The word for a goat, like the animal, in Welsh is gafr, in Irish it's gawr. So you can see that there are these words that are similar enough, but for the most part these languages are not mutually intelligible at all, really, to any degree. Irish has been spoken in Ireland since at least the 4th century AD, and probably even before that, but that's the first attestation we have of Irish being written down in Ireland. And it was more or less the majority language in Ireland until the 16 or 1700s. And obviously, if you know anything about history, you know that Ireland was occupied by England at that point in time. And so Irish as a language, it became less used than English due to a number of factors. Irish was discouraged from being used. Obviously, when the Great Famine happened, 2/3 of the population, they were out of Ireland, 1/3 died, and 1/3 emigrated, normally to North America, particularly the United States. And that plus the push to learn English as a kind of language of education or middle class people kind of caused the Irish language to lose a lot of ground. And now in Ireland, a majority of the people speak English as their first language, and they speak it in the home. There's a very small group of people that still speak Irish as their first language, but they are usually on kind of the western fringe of Ireland, and they're in Gaeltacht, or Gaeltachti, I guess I should say. And you really don't see so many people speaking Irish as a first language in Ireland, unfortunately. However, there is a large percentage of people that speak Irish as a second language. A lot of people in Ireland do have a very basic working knowledge of Irish. The state of the language right now is a little bit difficult to ascertain because people generally have this phenomenon where they greatly overestimate or greatly underestimate their skills with the Irish language. Sometimes you run into people that don't think they speak it that well and they actually speak it quite well. And then other times you run into someone that thinks they might speak it very well and then they don't really know much more than a few phrases. Irish is one of the official languages of Ireland. It's actually the first official language of Ireland. And English is the other official language. And if you go to Ireland, you'll see that a lot of street signs, airports, government buildings, even in pubs, in unofficial places, you can see examples of the Irish language all over the place. And you do hear it from time to time, but not really as much as English, as I talked about before. A common question that I really get asked a lot is it called Irish or is it called Gaelic? Calling it Gaelic is something that's kind of looked upon as being a little bit odd sounding, and it kind of marks you as being foreign and not from Ireland, because calling it Gaelic is not something that really people do in Ireland. The language is called Irish, and if you want to be kind of pedantic with the definition, then Gaelic, I suppose, is, you could refer to Scottish Gaelic, which is the similar but not exactly the same language that is spoken in Scotland. Or I've oftentimes heard people refer to Gaelic as the two languages together, that Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic together make the Gaelic languages. And that's not really helped at all by the fact that in the Irish language is called the Gaeilge. So it sounds similar to Gaelic. So the Irish language in Irish is called Gaeilge. But to call it Gaelic in English, it does sound a little bit funny, and it kind of marks you as being probably somebody from the United States or at least North America, because people in Ireland don't call it Gaelic, they call it Irish. Another language that I get asked often a lot about Irish is, why is the spelling so crazy? And normally people will give examples like popular Irish names, because that's, I think, how people in the United States are most often familiar with seeing Irish spelling. If you look at a lot of famous actors and actresses or singers, then you can see examples like Sinead O'Connor or Saoirse Ronan. You can see Irish spelling used, and it's confusing to an English-speaking person, and the spelling seems very counterintuitive to somebody that speaks English. I won't deny that Irish spelling can sometimes seem a little bit overly complicated, but for example, a name like Sinead, I don't think I find necessarily super complicated. And the reason why that is because in the Irish language, consonants, they will make different sounds depending on whether the vowel that follows them is broad or slender. Broad vowels are a, o, u, and slender vowels are a and e. So an S before an a or e, it makes a sh sound. My name in Irish is Seosamh, which is S-E-O-S-A-M-H. So you can see that the first S sound is a sh, it comes before a, and the second S is a s, it's coming before an a. And if we look at my Irish name further, we can see that there's an M and an H at the end, and that's something you see a lot in Irish spelling too, that there's these kind of like errant H's everywhere, or they appear errant at least. But the H exists to soften consonants. There's this concept in Irish of lenition, which means the softening of consonants, and that's done for grammatical purposes, and sometimes it's just in words naturally. So when you see an H like that, the H doesn't have any value per se. Sometimes it will, but when it's attached to a consonant, it's just to show a softening of that consonant. And funnily enough, when you see names that begin with J's in English, they tend to begin with that sh sound in Irish. Sinead is, I think, the equivalent of Janet in English. Sean is John, Seamus is James, Seosamh is Joseph. And the other thing I would say about Irish spelling that looks a little bit crazy is the vowel combinations. There is this rule in Irish where if you have a consonant, then it needs to be surrounded on both sides by the same type of vowel. So broad vowels have to go with broad vowels, and slender vowels have to go with slender vowels. For example, if you look at my name Seosamh, where we have SEO, we can see that the O and the A, they're both broad vowels and they surround the S in the middle. It would be impossible to have a broad vowel on one side and a slender vowel on the other side. So for that reason, you can sometimes see combinations of vowel sounds that are necessary in the language due to the way that it works, where the broad has to go with broad and slender has to go with slender. Another question that I get a lot is about the status of the language, as in, is the language alive or dead? Is it living? Is it growing? It's hard to answer that question because at times it does feel like the Irish language is in a kind of renaissance. And a lot of times now, especially in the modern days, a lot of parents will push their children to go to Irish schools to learn the Irish language to a decent amount. And I think there is a lot more pride in learning the Irish language than there has been historically in the past. I think in the past it was kind of associated with a kind of like low class phenomenon, or it was kind of associated with kind of violent terrorism or the IRA. And I feel like now that kind of association has mostly died out, and people are proud of the Irish language just for the sake of holding on to their heritage and history. So I do think that the Irish language is probably not going anywhere anytime soon, but it's definitely not as spoken of a language as English, obviously. But you could also make the argument that it's spoken by just as many people as some other languages in Europe that are minority languages, and those aren't dying or going away anytime soon, at least not in the foreseeable future. So I don't think that Irish is a dead language. I don't think that it's dying. It is in a bit of a precarious situation right now, but I think that it will live on, at least in my lifetime, if not many lifetimes beyond that, hopefully.